A homeless boy asked for her leftovers.
Please, may I have that?
She almost said no, but something about his eyes stopped her. She saw his eyes. They were identical to her lost son's eyes.
The rain had been falling over the city for 3 days straight when Caleb first saw her. He was 11 years old, though his eyes carried the weight of a man 3 times that age. His shoes had holes in them, his jacket was 2 sizes too small, and his stomach had learned to live on the memory of food rather than the taste of it. He stood outside the glass doors of Le Méridien, the finest restaurant in the city, watching through the window as waiters in white gloves carried plates of food that cost more than he had seen in his entire life. He was not there to steal. He was there because a kind cook sometimes let him take what was left on the plates before they were thrown away. Tonight, he was hoping for the same mercy. Inside, at a table near the window, sat a woman the whole city knew by name. Eleanor Whitmore was 48 years old, worth more than $4 billion, and one of the most recognized faces in American business. Magazines called her ruthless. Employees called her fair but unyielding. The press loved to photograph her stepping out of black cars and tailored coats, her expression unreadable, her eyes carrying something no reporter had ever managed to name. What none of them knew, what she had buried so deep that even she sometimes forgot it existed, was that 15 years ago she had lost a son. Not to death, to something crueler, to a mistake she had spent a decade and a half trying to undo, and had never once succeeded. Caleb pushed open the door of the restaurant, ignoring the doorman's protest, and walked straight toward her table. He did not know who she was. He only knew that her plate still had half a steak on it, and that his little sister was waiting under a bridge 2 blocks away with nothing in her stomach but hope. He stopped in front of Eleanor Whitmore and, in a voice steadier than his shaking hands, asked if she was going to finish her food. The restaurant went quiet. A billionaire and a homeless child, face to face, and neither of them knowing yet that the universe had just closed a circle 15 years in the making. Eleanor looked up, ready to wave away the interruption the way she waved away everything that threatened to slow her down. But something stopped her. It was his eyes, a shade of green she had only ever seen in one other person, a color she used to study every night before bed when he was small enough to fit against her shoulder. She told herself it was nothing. Grief plays tricks on people, and she had learned long ago not to trust every flicker of recognition that crossed a stranger's face. Still, her hand trembled as she slid the plate toward him. "Take it," she said. "Take all of it." He thanked her and turned to leave, but she found herself standing, calling out before she could stop herself. "Wait, what's your name?" If this story is already pulling at something in you, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because what happens next between this boy and this woman will stay with you long after tonight, and this channel exists to bring you stories exactly like it every single week. Caleb hesitated and used to anyone caring enough to ask. "Caleb," he said. Caleb Reyes. The last name meant nothing to her. Not yet. 15 years ago, before the money, before the company, before the empire she'd built out of grief and stubbornness, she had gone by a different name. She had married young, foolishly some said, to a man named Marcus Reyes who worked the docks and dreamed too big for his own good. They'd had a son together, a boy with her eyes and his father's stubborn chin, and they'd named him Caleb. Then came the accident, the fire, the night that took her husband, took her home, and in the chaos of hospitals and grief and a system that failed her at every turn, took her son as well, placed into foster care under a clerical error that listed her as deceased alongside her husband. By the time she'd fought her way back to sanity, back to a name and a bank account and enough power to search, the trail had gone cold. Foster records sealed. Names changed. A boy who might have been anywhere in the country, or might not have survived at all. She did not say any of this to the child standing before her. She could not. Her mind was moving too fast, drowning in a possibility too enormous to speak aloud. Instead, She asked where he was staying, and when he admitted, with the practiced shame of a child who had learned to expect judgment, that he and his sister slept under the Fairview Bridge, she made a decision that would have shocked every board member and business partner who thought they understood her. She told him to wait. She called her driver, and for the first time since the fire, Eleanor Whitmore followed a child into the rain instead of running from her past. The bridge was worse than she had imagined. Cardboard for bedding, a single blanket shared between two children, a fire built from scrap wood in an old paint can. Caleb's sister, a girl of about 8 named Sophie, looked up with the same wary exhaustion Caleb wore, though her eyes were a different color, brown instead of green, and Eleanor reminded herself sharply that a shared last name and a familiar shade of green proved nothing. Coincidences happened. The city was full of Reyes's, full of orphaned children, full of tragedies that echoed each other without ever truly connecting. But she could not make herself leave. She crouched down in her $4,000 coat on the wet concrete and asked Sophie where their parents were. And Sophie, too young to have learned caution the way her brother had, answered plainly, "Mama died in a fire. Before I was born," Caleb says. He doesn't remember her either. Not really. Just that she smelled like vanilla. Eleanor Whitmore had worn the same perfume for 20 years. Vanilla and something floral beneath it, a scent her late husband used to tease her about, claiming he could find her in a crowded room with his eyes closed. She sat back on her heels in the rain, staring at 2 children who could not possibly be her own and yet fit every terrible detail of the story. She had never stopped grieving, and she understood, with the cold clarity that had built her entire empire, that she was no longer looking at strangers. She was looking at a case that needed solving, and for the first time in 15 years, she had a genuine lead. She did not tell the children who she was. Not yet. Instead, she did what any billionaire with an army of resources could do quietly and efficiently. She had them move that same night into a shelter partnership her foundation quietly funded, one with real beds, real food, and a promise of no questions asked, at least for the moment. She told Caleb only that she wanted to help, that she had seen something in him worth investing in, which was not a lie, only an incomplete truth. Then she called her head of security, a man named Thomas Rourke, who had worked for her since before the fire, and who was one of only 3 people alive who knew the full story of what she had lost. She gave him one instruction: find out everything about Caleb and Sophie Reyes, going back as far as records existed, and do not stop until you have an answer, even if the answer breaks her heart all over again. 3 days passed before Thomas returned with a folder thick enough to require 2 hands. Eleanor read it alone in her office at 2 in the morning. The city lights spread out below her like something from a film she was no longer sure she belonged in. The children's father, listed on record as Marcus Reyes, had died of an overdose 4 years ago, a man who had drifted through foster placements himself and never fully recovered from losing his own family young. Before that, before Marcus Reyes had ever taken in a toddler named Caleb from an overwhelmed county system, that same toddler had been listed under a different name entirely. Caleb Whitmore, born to Eleanor and her husband Marcus, the very same year as the fire that supposedly killed them both. A clerical error, just as she'd feared, had listed the infant as deceased alongside his father, when in truth a nurse working overtime that night had simply transposed 2 case files, sending a living, unharmed baby into the foster system under a stranger's paperwork while his mother lay in intensive care, unconscious, unable to correct a mistake she wouldn't learn about for years. Eleanor set the folder down and did not move for a long time. 15 years of searching, of private investigators who found nothing, of nights spent staring at the ceiling wondering if her son was alive or cold in an unmarked grave, and the answer had been a filing error, sitting quietly in a county database the entire time. She thought of every year she had missed, First steps she never saw. A first day of school attended by no one who loved him the way she would have. Birthdays spent in strangers' homes while she built boardrooms and signed acquisitions and told reporters that family was not something she had time for anymore. Because the truth, that family was something taken from her, was too painful to speak aloud. She went to him the next morning, not as a stranger offering charity, but as herself, dressed plainly for the first time in years, without the armor of tailored suits and practiced authority. She sat across from Caleb in the shelter's small visiting room and told him everything. About the fire, about the husband he never knew, about a mistake made by an overworked hospital system that had cost them both 15 years they would never get back. She did not expect him to believe her immediately, and he did not. Trust, she was learning, was not something a billionaire could simply purchase, no matter how much evidence she laid on the table. But she asked for one thing only: a DNA test, quick and painless, that would either confirm what her heart already knew or release her from a hope that would otherwise consume her for the rest of her life. The results came back 6 days later. Caleb sat beside her in a sterile office that smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, watching a doctor slide a single sheet of paper across the desk toward his mother. Eleanor's hands shook as she read it, though she already understood the number before her eyes fully focused. 99.99% probability of maternity. She did not cry the way people cry in movies, loud and immediate. Her tears came slowly, silently. The release of 15 years held so tightly in her chest that she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without that weight. Caleb watched her, still uncertain what to feel, still a boy who had learned the hard way that hope was often the first step toward disappointment. But when she reached for his hand, he did not pull away. The following months were not simple, and the story does not pretend otherwise. Trust took time to rebuild, and Caleb carried scars that money could not immediately heal. The quiet suspicion of a child who had learned that adults disappeared, that promises broke, that the world rarely gave without eventually taking something back. Sophie, though not Eleanor's biological daughter, refused to be separated from the only brother she had ever known, and Eleanor made the decision without hesitation to formally adopt her as well, unwilling to let one more child in this story lose the only family they had left. Lawyers were involved. Paperwork stretched across weeks. But for the first time since the fire, Eleanor Whitmore was building something not out of ambition, but out of love she had been forced to postpone for 15 years. The press eventually found the story, as the press always does, and for a brief period Eleanor's face was back on every front page, though this time not for a merger or a stock split, but for the astonishing reunion of a mother and the son she had been told was dead. Reporters asked how it felt, being handed back a piece of her life she thought was gone forever. She gave them very little, protecting Caleb and Sophie from a spotlight neither child had asked for. But she said one thing that ended up quoted in nearly every article that followed. She said that all the money in the world had never once made her feel as wealthy as the moment a homeless boy asked her for her leftovers, not knowing he was asking his own mother for a second chance at the only thing that had ever truly mattered. If you've made it this far, you already know this is the kind of story worth sharing. And if it moved you even a little, subscribing helps this channel keep telling stories about the moments that quietly rebuild broken families. Because there are more waiting, and you won't want to miss the next one. Years later, Caleb would tell people that the hardest part was never the poverty, nor the cold nights under the bridge, nor even the hunger that had once defined his entire existence. The hardest part was learning to believe that something good could last, that a mother who found him once would not somehow disappear again the way everything else in his young life had disappeared before. Eleanor understood that fear better than anyone, because she carried her own version of it, the terror that she would blink and lose him a second time, that the universe, which had already proven itself capable of such cruelty, might not be finished with her yet. But slowly, through birthdays actually celebrated, Through school pickups she refused to delegate to staff. Through quiet dinners at home instead of business functions, mother and son built something neither had believed themselves entitled to anymore. Not a fairy tale. Something sturdier than that. A family rebuilt, plank by plank, from the wreckage of a mistake 15 years old. Eleanor eventually restructured her foundation, redirecting a significant portion of her company's philanthropic arm toward reforming the very foster care systems that had failed her son, funding audits of record-keeping practices in hospitals and county agencies across the country, determined that no other mother would lose a child to a clerical error and spend a decade and a half believing him dead. Caleb, now attending a private school he had once only seen from a distance through restaurant windows, struggled at first to reconcile the boy he had been with the young man he was becoming, but found steady ground in his sister, in his mother's patient consistency, and eventually in a therapist Eleanor insisted the whole family attend together, refusing to let old wounds fester simply because their new life looked comfortable from the outside. The story of the homeless boy who asked a billionaire for her leftovers spread far beyond the initial headlines, becoming something people referenced whenever they needed reminding that the wealthiest people in any room are not always the ones with the fullest bank accounts, and that sometimes the family we've lost is closer than we think, waiting only for the right rainy night, the right restaurant, the right plate of food left unfinished. Eleanor never forgot the sight of her son standing in that doorway, soaked and hungry and utterly unaware of who she was. And she often said that of every deal she had closed in her long career, none had ever mattered as much as the one sealed that night, without a single signature. Only a plate slid across a table and a question that changed everything. "Take it," she had told him. "Take all of it." And in the end, that was exactly what he did. Not just the food, but a mother, a sister, and a second chance at a life that had once been stolen from them both. Years from now, when Caleb tells this story to his own children, he won't lead with the fire, or the years on the street, or even the money that changed everything overnight. He'll lead with a single sentence his mother said to him that rainy night outside a restaurant window. "Take it. Take all of it." Because that's what love does when it finally gets a second chance. It doesn't hold back. It doesn't calculate. It gives everything. If this story reminded you that the people we've lost are sometimes closer than we think, hit like, subscribe for more stories like this one, and tell me in the comments. If you had 30 seconds to say one thing to someone you'd lost touch with, what would you say?